Okay, welcome to the what is this again? Trans-apocalyptic Oasis show, and this is a very special edition. It's called Layman and Marshall Save the World. Welcome back, Layman.
Excited to be here. Looking forward to saving the world. Happy to see your weird optical unibrow.
Thank you. Yeah, what's up with that?
I don't know. Have you got your light sort of like horizontal or something?
What do you mean horizontal?
I don't know. It looks like it's looks like it's maybe a halo just hovering in space a few feet in front of you.
No, you can't see the actual halo. No, it's flat.
All right, I believe you.
It's a lot bigger than yours, though.
It's not the size. It's the motion of the photons. All right, what are we doing here? You got some questions for us, or is there some kind of structure, or are we just slumming it?
Well, okay. So we're talking about saving the world. We were going to talk about something. What we were going to talk about?
I think we were talking about like guidance and like
okay,
IQ and like profiling the interiors of people, stuff like that.
Profiling, right? Yeah, let's talk about guidance, because, and the reason this relates to saving the world is because external structures are becoming increasingly unreliable. And now you got people, it seems like people they're following Facebook groups and stuff for guidance on what to do and how to act. And this is basically destroying the world. So I thought we would talk about how people can reorient so that they are following something more reliable that that leads to optimization rather than chaos as we're experiencing. So what are the different kinds of guidance in your view?
Well, it's interesting because my first thought is actually how do you unplug from the pseudo-guidance first so that you have some space available? Like how do you learn and how do you teach people to not believe and not get hooked on the incoming cultural signals?
Yeah,
there's a mental part to that of like remembering that they're there to manipulate you and giving yourself that mindfulness space so that you don't believe things just because you see them. But I think a lot of it is somatic. That's what I've been thinking about a lot this week, which is if here's the incoming digital media information, and here's the information from like your sensory field and your body and your human experience, as long as you're accessing that. But if you're only accessing what you're thinking about and how you're feeling in response to things, then it's about 50-50. And maybe the incoming thing is a reality that you have to either go with or fight back against or something like that. But if you're nested, if you're sitting in your somatic experience, then it's much easier to not be swept away by those things and to not treat either bullshit information or groupthink or skewed manipulative algorithms as if they were a form of guidance. And then you're in a space where you could say, okay, what are my other guidance alternatives?
Right. Okay. There's a few interesting things there. One is, embodiment. What does that process entail? I mean, we're naturally embodied. And then we unlearn it. So how does that happen? How do we unlearn? How do we unlearn embodiment first?
Well, I don't know if we have proof that we're naturally embodied. I mean, we have bodies, but what the infant's or the young child's experience of embodiment is, I think, is debatable. But whether or not we're regaining it or getting it for the first time doesn't really matter. The question, because the way you would get it is the same now.
All right, let's debate it then.
All right.
why is it debatable? Are you saying that infants are born with some kind of separation? I mean, where is consciousness centered, and how is it boundaried that it wouldn't include the body?
Well, its scenario might go like this. Consciousness is learning to occupy the entity, and that this takes time, and it has to grow the neurological functions to enable it to inhabit the body. And that's like learning language. It's like learning to walk. It's like learning about other people. There's a whole process over time that it takes. Just right when you watch a kid and they're happy one second, they're screaming the next, and their arms are moving and they don't seem to have any control over it, you can wonder what the degree of intelligent inhabitation of that body really is. Now, we could say there's a baseline organic sensitivity to being an embodied unit, but we don't have to suppose that.
Okay, but then what explains, I mean, it seems like aminals have, they're embodied. Are they not?
We don't know what it's like to be an aminal. Certainly, right, when we look at them, we're either seeing a real embodiment that reminds us of the real embodiment we lost, or we're seeing our future projection of what embodiment could be like if we actually attain it for the first time. And I don't know that there's a solution. It's a bit like, I think our ancestors often imagined future better worlds by saying there used to be one of those, right? Let's make America great again. Let's go back to Atlantis. Once upon a time, there was a very wise system set up. It's possible that there was, but it's also possible that we are like rigging the future for ourselves by imagining it into the past.
Right, I hear you. Which is why I'm here in the Wild West.
The good old days.
Yeah, seems we're entering a new Wild West. So, but wait a second. How could that be if the way the spine is oriented in the chakras, an evolution, with the base of the spine being the most fundamental, wouldn't that imply that the lower centers are the most fundamental? Wouldn't that imply that aminals have some kind of embodiment there, some kind of basis for their consciousness in the lower parts of the body?
Well, two things, right? If you take the view that there wasn't necessarily an original embodiment that was lost, I think what you have to assume then is there's a degree, a gradient of degrees of increasing embodiment. So it's not like you're going from none to some. There's some, wherever you find it, there's some, but the kind of embodiment we're talking about when we think, oh, we need to be embodied, that might be way down that list. Right? It might be that normal human stupidity is in some ways more embodied than a child or an animal. We're just not really sure. What we want to go is further down that. So it might be a going back, or it might be an increasing. But I do want to say, as I often do, I think the idea of lower chakras is kind of a bullshit idea, right? I don't think most spines are vertical. Right? Human beings, if you're the meditator sitting there, you're going to think there's this verticality and that maybe your genitals are low and your brain is high. But as a human being, you're laying down like half the time, and all the other animals with spines have basically horizontal spines. So the normal condition of spines,
fine, it's not vertical, but it's still like linear.
Yeah. So that's a situation in which all of the chakras are basically there all the time as kind of peers negotiating a growth. Rather than growing in one direction along the spine, all those spinal centers can have the opportunity to grow. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is what it's like when they're all kind of relatively balanced with each other. I think there must be conditions for other creatures that have spines where their amount of different chakra type intelligences combine with each other in a relatively harmonious way, and they have something like a peak experience or a religious experience within their context.
Okay, but the lesser advanced animals have fewer chakras, right?
Maybe. There's two interpretations. There's two interpretations, right? One interpretation is every system has the full spectrum, but just at a more minuscule and less significant form, right? Maybe a worm has all of them, but they're basically meaningless. The other way to look at it is chakras are added over the course of evolution, and like a spider or a snake is creepy because it's just a muladhara with a tail or something like that. And unless we had a good experiment to test that, we wouldn't really know. But there's at least two interpretive models.
I gotcha. Well, so you have the heart. You have the higher mammals are more heart-centered. I don't know. Do you find that kind of stuff in lower animals?
You could argue that you find it, but in a more primitive fashion, right? That maybe what we call heart, if you gave it 100, a snake has some heart, but it has 5 or something like that. It has so little that it almost doesn't matter to us. It's like when we talk about, does consciousness go all the way down, right? And you can say, well, maybe it does, but it's also possible that at lower levels of structural sophistication, the amount of consciousness at some point becomes negligible, so that even though it's there, saying there's no consciousness might be a pretty fair description.
Okay. So when we talk about embodiment, we're not just talking about the functioning of centers. And we're not just talking about the felt sense of those centers or feeling all of those centers at once. You're talking about something else.
I'm talking about something that's like a blending of centers, right? So you've got whatever's going on for you physiologically, and you've got whatever's going on for you in terms of your intellect and your attention capacity. When you put those together, then you have this somatic experience. And whether that's a return to something that was primitively balanced or whether it's an innovation, I don't think it really matters. I think we can bring mind and body together in a way where the mind essentially inhabits the experience of the body, and this blending creates an additional set of functions and experiences that isn't normal in human experience unless you sort of do it on purpose.
I see.
It's what they do in Tai Chi and martial arts and things like that, right? You're going to use intention to lead the body, but you're also going to intentionally be with the body in whatever it's doing as a wholeness.
Okay, so
and that's tingly.
So okay, so you're talking about mind blending with body.
Yes.
What is the mind here?
The mind here is one specialized subjective subsystem of the unit that's very good at looking and scheduling and organizing. It's a sort of a capacity to view and track.
Scheduling,
yeah.
So like, I'm gonna be in my, dick chakra like 3 o'clock today.
Yeah, you need the mind for that. Yeah, your dick chakra is going to be like, hey, I'm active right now, and the mind's going to be like, no, we're doing that at 3 o'clock today. You're like,
okay,
right.
That's an important function.
Yeah.
It seemed okay. So I don't see how does the mind get embodied, or like, what is the relationship of the mind? It seems like embodiment is leaving the mind.
It does seem like that, and I think that's a useful way to provide instructions for people to do practices that are in fact the mind coming closer to the body. There's a big difference between what we say to people in order to get them to do something useful and what's an actual objective description of reality. So we say, listen, I want you to let go of your mind and just be the body. You're not just being the body. The mind is actually letting go of some things it was doing on its own, and it's coming over to where the body is, and it's hanging out there and trying to let the body be as present as it is. So they're together, they're co-functioning, they have the opportunity to harmonize in an experience that will go beyond the normal experience of the mind and the normal experience of the body. And we might want to say, well, I totally let go of my mind because that's where I started the procedure, but that's not necessarily a technical description of what happened.
I got you. Let me tell you my experience of embodiment. So as soon as we talk about embodiment, I remember, oh, I'm not totally in my body right now. So what I do is I sense. Okay. I sense, I sync. There's a sense of more being present in this moment. There's more vertical sensation, and there's more fullness, and so on and so forth. Is that embodiment?
Yeah. That's I mean, and we could say it's a return to embodiment, or we could say it's an increase in the degree of embodiment. And it involved you having a mental response and then an intentional act that brought your experience on purpose and more consciously closer to what is going on in your whole lived physiological experience.
This is the wrong, I think, motivation to have a thought and then let the thought lead embodiment. It's almost like it would happen naturally if I wasn't up in my head, kind of thing. If I wasn't conditioned to be in my head.
But that's an observation from the point of view of your head, right? Your head's like, oh, hey, I'm stuck up in my head and I should go back to the body. And is there a natural way for that to happen? Sorry. So that's the head is talking to itself about how it could get back in touch with the body more intensely. And there's a number of ways it could do it, right? One way is, you're going to bring intention and discipline to the body. Another one is like, you're just going to feel on purpose more deeply into the sensory experience. Another one is you're going to use the head to arrange a circumstance in which your bodily experience is sort of more natural and more intense, and the head gets subsumed and sucked into that. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but as soon as we think about doing it, then we're in the head and we have to do it somehow.
So when I become embodied, I become aware of all the ways I'm not embodied, meaning it's like, okay, in my solar plexus, there's this tightness, and I'm embodied in the sense of my what is that? Interoception is increased both in intensity and in what feels like spatial expanse.
Yeah.
Okay. But then I become aware of things that aren't functioning so well. Like I said, the solar plexus is tight. So in a sense, I'm embodied perception wise, but there are parts of my body that are not totally online. And so it seems like I'm not truly embodied if those centers aren't functioning, balanced, harmonized, whatever.
Sure. You could be more embodied, right? So we're walking around in our normal experience. We are to some degree embodied. And then we go, hey, I'm going to return to my body. I'm going to drop some of these isolated thought focuses and bring the mind where the body is. So now I'm sensing in my parts, and I'm sensing all of my parts simultaneously. I got this great embodied thing. I'm more embodied, but then I look at it and go, but I'm not as embodied as I possibly could be, right? There might be ways of decontracting activity that's going on in my centers. There might be ways of making a richer contact with other people and other entities and the environment around me. Also, there's more than just a mind and a body, right? I might want to bring some emotions into this mix, right? So there's other domains of things we can also bring in. It's not like the mind and body are the only thing, but embodiment is a great first step along a lot of pathways.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about Eros.
Okay.
and the embodied experience of Eros, because there's a lot of people now talking about reconnecting with Eros as a means of guidance. The idea being that you follow the energy in your body and the movements that it wants to make. And this is not like subtle energy, it's more like causal energy. So you are following the energy movements of your body, and that is a reliable form of guidance, and that naturally connects you with your body, and gives you the exact feelings in your body that you need in any moment, because it's the optimizing force. Eros is the optimizing force, or at least one of them. And so it should be a reliable guide. It should, if you follow it, it should lead to optimization of the whole self system, in the same way that it does for animals who don't have the higher mind functions that get in the way, that get preferenced or privileged.
I'm cautious about that. I think that it's an important thing to focus on, right? Like if we imagine the mind and the body as like falling left or falling right on a bicycle, that's automatically taken care of if you're pedaling forward on a bicycle, right? So there's a kind of flow state activity where we follow our Eros prompts in various dimensions of ourselves that can sort of naturally bring multiple parts of ourselves into coordination with each other and provide a richer intensity and authenticity of experience. But I'm cautious about being too metaphysical about that, right? It's not clear that animals necessarily always do the right thing. It's not clear that Eros is magically the perfect optimizer of all experiences. It's probably a very important factor to take into account. It helps a lot, especially if you haven't been focusing on it. But that improvement is not necessarily a perfect omniscient function. It may just be better.
Better than
not doing
not having it.
Yeah. If you're no good at that, if you can't find your Eros, if you can't find it in different parts of yourself, if you can't act on it, if you have no skill in that area, then you're living an insufficiently authentic human life, and you probably have a great deal of trouble making viable decisions that are enriching. And then there's a whole additional set of wisdom, I think, about how to handle that in non-stupid ways, because you could get carried away with shallow or wrong perceptions of Eros. But even then, it's one of the functions. It may not be the sole function.
But it is the creative force. So so to the extent that you follow it, you're participating in creation, in the creative force of the universe, of the divine.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that what you're recognizing and following is sufficient as a representation of the creative force of the divine. Like salt water is water, 100%, but it's not water you should drink.
So you're saying my Eros is salty?
You got salty Eros, man.
Yeah.
As people who have licked you can well attest.
Yeah. How did you know about that?
I've seen it. It's on a couple of Facebook pages. There's a private discussion group.
I get around.
It's a whole post-lick community.
Okay. So, all right. So Eros, it may be one form of guidance. What else
I'm all
we
for
got?
it. I'm all for it. I'm just cautious about exaggerating its metaphysical sufficiency.
Okay. I mean, those who do get like real deep into that, they report an absence of struggle, that they experience flow, effortlessness, They experience results in the physical, like they have whatever they would need or want, actually. Because here's the interesting thing. It's like, why do we have desires? Why do we desire what we desire? It seems like we are encoded, that our souls are encoded with a particular experience, like that we are to have, right? Why do we have the desires that we desire, assuming there's no egoic conditioning stuff in there? It seems like we come into this world encoded to have a certain experience. And if we sort of get rid of all the conditioning, then that Eros can lead us to the experiences we are supposed to have in this lifetime.
I agree with a lot of that. I think that desire is a deep existential and inherently spiritual quality that brings a lot of different dimensions together, and that we all need to get better at discerning what's healthy desire in all of the different systems we have inside ourselves, and getting more skill in being able to enact and follow desire in each of those different forms that it has. And then that, if the better we are at that, the more dimensions of ourselves we bring into the world and the more we merge with the world. Now, where I hesitate is, is it only a purity that's being constrained by conditioning, or is it also a skill that we need to get better at? To what degree are we able to constantly get more sophistication in teasing apart what seems like a desire into something that's actually a more refined desire? Like, something looks like a desire as it would to an animal, but it turns out if you look inside that, if you open up the molecule and look at the atoms, they've each got their own desires, and now you're at a higher level of resolution, and now you have to negotiate between these different kinds of desires. And I also would say that there's no reason to be opposed to inner struggle, right? That some people might want to say, I only want to just go with my desires and not do any work of struggling against myself. But you also have desires that disagree with each other, and that's the opportunity for them to struggle and integrate and become a new kind of desire that you didn't previously notice that you had. So you could get super good at expressing desire in a particular arena, but you also have to do something else with your desires to grow into a new arena where desires might take a different form.
I see, but if you have conflicting desires, it's most likely that one of those is a true desire and another is a conditioned desire. Because otherwise you're implying that like Eros is conflicting with itself.
I am implying that Eros is conflicting with itself as a means of furthering its manifestation, let's say, right? Like how a tree grows by branching. So Eros can also grow by branching, and those branches can come back together. And when they recognize that they have something in common, then they can integrate into a more refined version of that phenomenon, right? So it's, yes, there are desires that are thwarted, and I have to unlearn that thwart or learn something more sophisticated so that I can get beyond that thwart. But there are also desires that there's no reason to think they would inherently be aligned, and that I have the opportunity as a voluntary participant in the universe to agree to let them struggle and combine, to sort of upgrade reality through my own manifestation.
Word.
Okay,
let's talk about other forms of guidance, because I feel like I'm commanded all the time, right? Like there was a command this morning that was like, get out of bed. It's like, you got to go talk to that lame man at whatever. And so I get these kinds of commands, and some of them are like, go lay down, maybe when I shouldn't lay down. And some of them are higher commands, like do your taxes or something like that. And my lower commands, I call it higher and lower. Lower is like, nah, don't do it. That's boring. So I'm getting all these different commands all the time. And when I follow the lower commands, my life leads into comfort and stasis, and it just kind of, it dulls my life force.
Mhm.
So, and then there's like intuition or something, which is like this little hit of like, oh, you should do this. It's a different quality. So I've got like child commands, I've got adult commands, and then I've got these intuitive commands, and so on and so forth. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, before Jordan Peterson got involved in politics and social issues, I think his book Maps of Meaning was really intriguing. And one of the things he suggests in that book is that your desires across multiple scales can be integrated somehow, and that the experience of meaningfulness is the experience, it's like the indicator light that tells you how many of the different scales of desire are operating simultaneously. So you're like, I have a desire, I want to do something, but I also want my family to be alive, and I want to get desires and have the people I care about also get their desires. And I want that to happen right now, but I also want that to happen tomorrow. And I also want that to happen a year from now. And I also want that to happen over the next 10 years. And I'd also like maybe humanity to do pretty well over the next 1,000 years or whatever. So I have these time scales, right? So I've got a desire that would be a successful desire for me personally, like, I'm going to go eat that chocolate bar. And that's a great desire on the frame of the next 5 minutes. But over the frame of the next 2 hours, I'm going to be like, why did I eat that fucking chocolate bar? So some of the negotiation between what seems like the child desire and the adult desire is a negotiation between different time scales. And then we might think not in terms of these time scales arguing with each other, but as a kind of a guidance that comes from how many of these can we meet simultaneously. If I can do something that feels good now and is going to make me feel better over the next week and over the next year and be of benefit to the people I care about, then that's a pretty sweet pleasure. That's right. And so that's a better pleasure. It's maximizing across multiple scales. Now, I think the interesting thing about the intuitive prompt, which is in addition to eat a chocolate bar or do your taxes, is there's a possibility to gain a capacity that our ancestors called the will. We don't talk about it like that as much anymore, but there's a capacity to integrate your activities and your intuitive impulses at a higher level of significance than we normally do. And that requires a discipline of not only hearing those things and taking them seriously, but making yourself do them, because the child impulses have this sort of simple animal body energy that helps them along. Like, oh, I'm going to eat that chocolate bar. And then the adult ones have this like, oh shit, I got to do that. They have an extra thing that helps you do them. But when you come to an intuitive impulse, like maybe I'll paint a picture, maybe I'll move to space.
Right.
There's no extra thing that helps you do that. You have to volunteer to do that shit on purpose. And that requires a discipline. So you have to build up a strength to turn your whims into manifestations. And that kind of yokes your whim dimension and your manifestation dimension together and makes you like a hybrid entity of some kind.
Which gets into mystery. Because let's say you're always following guidance, or your intuition, okay? Your intuition is always going to be having you do things and you have no idea why. And that's the thing. You have no idea why, so you're always going into the mystery.
Yeah, you've got to become much better friends with that. And this pertains to the Eros question as well, because there's different ways to approach Eros, right? Some people think, I know what I desire and I'm going to do it. And if I feel uncomfortable, that means I'm not doing it properly. But if you're going to act in mystery, that means you have to be willing, at least at the outset to be a little bit uncomfortable.
Sure.
There's cognitive, you're like, I don't know why. This is not making me feel comfortable right now.
Right.
I just know that I have a prompt and I'm going to do the efforts and see what happens. And possibly because I've done it before and it's worked out. So I have some trust in the process. But yeah, you have to be willing to withstand both the mental dimension of mystery and be kind of have a good opinion of it, and understand the somatic difficulty that your body is going to feel when you don't know what the fuck you're doing or why you're doing it. You have to be able to withstand the dissonance of having no overriding explanation of your action. Yeah.
So let's say my intuition says, okay, move to France. And my mind, my body is going to be freaking out. It's going to be like, what? No, I can't. Why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. We try to make it reasonable in the mind. And we feel the fear, the anxiety, the tension in the body. And without embracing the mystery, we'll probably just be like, nah, that's a silly idea. I'm not going to do that. And then your life just sort of leads away from optimization. So you're saying we need the ability to recognize the reactivity and sort of do the thing anyway. It's kind of like a blind faith or blind allegiance.
It is
blind submission.
That can sound more daunting than it actually is, because it's a skill set that you build up over time, right? So if you were going from 0 to trusting the mystery, that sounds like a dramatic shift in terms of blind allegiance. But if you're actually working a little bit every day to practice these things, then when a larger one comes along, you think, I've had some experience of this before. It actually worked out okay. It might be my optimization prompt. I know it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I should lean into that because it's probably taking me somewhere interesting, even though I don't know. So there's a sense in which we don't have to view it as some dramatic submission to a force we cannot comprehend. It can become an easy, friendly phenomenon if we incrementally develop our capacity to tolerate and enact. You got your mute on there.
Shh. Is it fair to say we come into this world abiding in mystery?
I'm going to give the answer I have to give in terms of all retroactive assessments is there's two interpretations, right? We could, and no,
so
first of all, let me say this. There's no reason to think we all come into the world the same way, right? Homogeneity is not necessarily the nature of the human experience, whether it's coming into life or whether it's dying. The same thing doesn't necessarily happen to everyone. Well, let's put that aside for a second. So you come into the world. Now, even though I have a memory of birth, I acquired it in my 20s. So it's dubious. So most of us don't remember our early
dubious life. You were smoking a doobie when it came in?
Yeah. Oh man.
My mother's vagina.
In terms of conscious, rational, stable knowledge, we don't have that when we come into the world as born creatures. On the other hand, we might look at that situation and say, look, you're a little human animal, and what you have is a total overwhelm of knowledge. Everything is real to you. You have no distance from it whatsoever, right? We might think of that as mystery, or we might think of it as just a huge amount of knowledge where none of it's mysterious because you can't get on top of any of it. You experience no mystery whatsoever, just a whole bunch of fucking non-mysteries flying at you all the time in every direction. And then you struggle over years to get free enough so that you can abide a little bit in some mystery. So there's two interpretive options there.
Yeah, so mystery, we're sort of talking, there's, I guess, a few ways to talk about it. One is the absence of something, the absence of knowing. But I'm curious, what is mystery the presence of? of?
I think it's the presence of a coherence that hasn't yet been identified. And that's an important feature of a developmental view of the universe, because no matter what you've recognized as reality, whether consciously or just in terms of your ability to behave with things that exist, there's a next level. And the next level is coherent. It's real, but you haven't recognized it yet. And there's a sense of risk. So beyond that sense of risk, I think there is a coherence that you can encounter, but it's not a coherence that's landed yet. You don't have an identity for it. You can't get on top of the pattern. So it's essentially, I would say, it's like nonlinear computational complexity. It's a real pattern. You can't recognize it. Maybe ever, but at least not yet.
Yeah, so you're talking about creation or the process of creation. Okay, so I'm thinking about diamond approach and the boundless dimensions. The creation corresponds to what they call the logos dimension or creative dynamism. But more fundamental than that is the absolute. And that's the infinite emptiness. And that is actually the mystery. That is the thing that can never be truly known. The source.
So what I'm saying is let's call it pressure. The pressure of the unknowable on the system generates a creative space of new knowability. Right. And you're doing that in relationship to what's inherently unknowable, but the inherently unknowable enables new knowabilities as you go. So as you approach the unknowable, you get new knowables. It never ceases to be unknowable.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the unknowable is always exerting a pressure that leads to new knowables.
Right. And that's another form of the Eros concept, like an ontological form.
Right. The Eros is the unknowable in action. Animated.
Yeah.
Animated mystery.
It's the knowable relating to the unknowable.
Okay, cool. I didn't know that.
I'm fascinated by unknowabilities, whether it's shamanic or magical or computational or logical. There's the things we know, then there's the things we don't know that we could know, and then there's things that maybe are unknowable in their very essence, and we don't know what that's like. It's very nice to say the unknowable, but is it singular or plural? Well, we don't know. Maybe there's a bunch of them. Maybe there's entities that are inherently unintelligible to us. Maybe there's forms of our own insight that are inherently unknowable. We can still use them. We just can't ever know about it, right? If maybe there's other species on other worlds that are way better at the unknowable than we are. And if they showed up on our planet, we'd be like, what the fuck is that? Why aren't they landing and like subjugating the humans or taking our gold or initiating us into the Galactic Republic? And we're just like, hey, they showed up and they acted like a blip, and then they zipped away. And then later they showed up on a farm and asked a guy for pancakes and then vanished, right? We're like, what the fuck is that? Is that an entity that's much more rooted in the unintelligible than we are?
Okay. So let's ground, because we're trying to save the world. And this is kind of an abstract discussion.
Okay. Bring us back around.
And so I want to talk about, like, how do we use mystery to save the world? There are probably people watching this right now. Yes, that's you. Who they don't have the experience of mystery much, if ever. You know, they're stuck in knowing. They always think they know things. You know, they're living in a reality that's defined by their knowledge. So, you know, why should they? why should they leave the world of the known?
I think they're encountering the unknown very often, but they're not processing it. They're just sort of skirting by it and suffering from it in a kind of background sense, right? Everybody's always in situations where they're not sure. And what they don't do is inhabit that space. And those are, I think of them as spaces where two things are adjacent to each other. So the in-between space between different things, like you're waiting for somebody and they haven't shown up yet, or you're going over to someone's house and you stop at the threshold. And at those in-between spots where you're not sure, where it could go either way, or you're not really clear, we tend not to value those. But if we value those and we show up in that space, what we get is a much richer map of reality. And if you wanted to affect reality for yourself or the world positively, you would need a better sense of what it actually is. And if you're just looking at these two clunky chunks and you don't see any of the in-between material, then you have a limited map, right? You have like a TV with 100 pixels. And what you really need is 10,000 pixels to see what the world consists of. And those other pixels are in the spaces between those initial clunky pixels. So you've got to show up in between spaces to get a richer sense of the world upon which you could act. So that's just an objective feature. The subjective feature is feels way better, right? Richness, depth, sense of guidance, sense of joy, sense of beingness, sense of being part of this thing that even if you look around at the system and go, oh, this system is fucked, but for some reason, I still feel pretty good. Right? It's very stabilizing and enriching.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of people are stuck in knowing reality as this like fucked up thing.
Yeah.
They're stuck in that mode of like, because they see all the disorder and all of the, destruction and the suffering, and they sort of crystallize in that awareness, and then they become bitter and angry, hateful, yada yada yada. That's their dominant experience of reality, and they have a real hard time escaping that. They don't even know that they're wrong.
Yeah, and they're in some ways they're correct, right? As a piece of knowledge, they might be saying a true thing, but they've evaded the sense of uncertainty and mystery that is attendant upon that experience. So they're not really inhabiting it. They're not really integrating that knowledge. They're having, in some ways, the wrong feeling response and being response to the facts that they're seeing. So it doesn't really matter that they're telling you something that could actually be the case. They might be right, they might be wrong, but even if they were correct, they're not living it properly. They're not living it in a way that would help. They're just like a conspiracy theorist, just excitedly pointing at something that disturbs them.
Yeah, this is so fucked up. Right. Okay, so let's get to the how.
All right.
How can we embody mystery now?
Well, this comes full circle because the embodiment practices are essential for any kind of embodiment, which is you have to be able to show up and to inhabit yourself properly, right? And when you're watching the news or when you're in any situation, there's a whole bunch of shit that's going on in here that you're not necessarily focused on. And you go, look, I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to be here. I'm going to feel all of my interactivities, even if I don't know what they mean and what they're pointing to. I'm going to be with it. If I'm uncertain, if there's dissonance, if I'm disagreeing with myself, if I don't know where the world's going, okay, I'm going to accept that. And I'm going to feel and let the effects of those feeling stimulations move through my system. So I think that's the first step, is to be able to embody, and then you could start to embody the mystery. And the nice part of that is that the difficult feeling, if you inhabit it for a while, you relax into it, and the difficulty becomes a smoother stimulation. So you end up feeling kind of open and kind of tingly and kind of good, kind of energized by a thing that was initially a problematic uncertainty.
Okay. Like right now.
Yeah.
I can relax my head. I sort of sink into my body. my visual perception shifts from everything being like really clear and defined and distinct to being fuzzy and shimmery, kind of iridescent even, like. And so I'm relaxing into that, and it's like, okay, I don't really know what's going on right now. And I can, I can hang out here for a little bit, and it's kind of fascinating. It's pulsing and luminous. Um, but at some point, some part of me is just like, what's the point of this? And it wants to go out and it wants to leave that space and, I don't know, do something, get something, achieve something, work on something, play with something, participate. So it seems difficult to take that experience of mystery with me as I'm functioning and moving through the world, because to do that, there has to be some familiarity. And it seems like the ego skews towards familiarity, wanting the familiar. So, say something about stabilizing as the mystery.
Yeah, when you say it is difficult, that's another, that's a synonym for requires a practice. Right? It's not that it's necessarily problematically difficult. It's that you have to do something to get better at that, just like you have to do something to get better at anything. So one of the things I like is the guy who founded TM has a great book called The Science of Being and the Art of Living. And so the first half is all of his speculations about how you do the subtle mantra practice that he recommended for people. And the second half of the book is how you bring that into life, right? So you access the state, and then you kind of stabilize it, and then you try to take action while remaining in touch with the state. And you're going to get lost. You're going to get distracted. That's why it's a practice. You're going to do it again. You're going to do it again. You're going to do it again. It's going to find its way into other areas. And this is a very general pattern, right? So you can have a meditative state. You can have a subtle energy state. You can have a variety of different kinds of access to things. And once you've got them, you've actually got them in one particular condition, right? I'm sitting in meditation and I access this condition. I'm in a real physical condition. I'm actually doing something. I have a body and I'm meditating and I'm accessing it. So right now I'm doing both. I've got the thing and I'm an embodied entity. So then the question is, can I take that thing and my embodiment and have them start to move out together into other areas? Can I colonize more areas of reality with that synchronization still going on? And it's tricky and you'll screw it up. But if you start trying, you'll get better at it.
So practice, discipline.
Practice, yes.
So I got to tell you this reaction that I'm having.
Okay.
I've been doing spiritual practices for, I don't know, nearly 2 decades or something. And there's something still profoundly unnatural about it. Like, some big part of me just it hears like another practice. It's like, if we actually do what you're saying, we have to spend like the next 30 years practicing like 100 different things so that we can finally live our lives when we're like 58 or something like that. It seems like we have to spend most of our life practicing in order to be able to live our life. And there seems like something just profoundly wrong about that.
Yeah, there's something unsettling about it. And it pertains when we think about it, it seems unnatural. But when we actually are doing a practice and it's working, then it feels very natural. So there's that dichotomy. But I think we need to unlearn the difference that we make in our minds between natural and artificial, and between effort and non-effort. Because I think if you, you think, well, am I going to live my whole life just trying to figure out how to live my life properly? That seems like a waste. But if trying to figure out how to live my life properly is in fact a description of how to accurately live my life properly, right? If the unexamined life is not worth living, then examining the life, trying to do things with it, is the correct natural mode of behavior for sapient organisms like ourselves. Then those two things can swoop in together. And I think we very often get stuck in this process by looking at what seem to be like two extreme alternatives. And the solution is usually to realize that they're not alternatives at all, right? There isn't a natural life and an artificial life, or a life of practice and a life of non-practice. If you're doing it better over time, your ability to tell them apart sort of blurs. Or at the very least, you find yourself unable to choose one or the other. So you're stuck. You got to keep going along with both somehow.
So it seems like there's a direction that my Eros is moving me. It wants me to do this and not that. And let's say I get the idea of like, I learn like that guy, I learn of the concept of spiritual enlightenment. And I'm like, oh, that's a really intriguing idea. That could like maybe solve all my problems. And so I'm like, okay, I go to this guy, I say, how do I get what you have? And he gives me like a list of practices. And then I devote myself to those practices. And I'm like, after a long time, it still feels like a lot of struggle. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's like I have actually moved away from what's natural to align with some external authority, some external structure, and I've actually moved off course, when the solution may just be to follow the instructions. It's like Eros is like, here are your instructions, do this. But for whatever reason, my mind thinks like, no, I need to do that. So even like having knowledge of spirituality and spiritual practices and disciplines and teachings and all of that leads us away from the natural condition, the natural flow, and the perception that there's all these actions that we have to take in order to be ourselves, live our life, unfold however we're supposed to unfold.
Again, I would lean towards undermining the distinction between the natural and the artificial. What if naturalness is the result of a process, right? That it's a produced experience where you're selecting the right thing in the right moment and doing the right practice in that moment. So it doesn't matter that there's all these practices. What matters is that you find the right practice in that moment, which is the practice that can unnaturally lead you to the experience of naturalness, right? And when you're like, oh, my mind's doing all this unnatural shit, and you go, well, and I'm unhappy with that, so that's even more mind. So it's not like we're getting back to some basic thing. We're adding more and more layers. And as we add these layers, we start to go, hey, I could, I'm not only critiquing my life and artificially manipulating it, I'm critiquing and trying to artificially manipulate my artificial critique. But that actually leaves me in a pretty good position where I might be able to figure out what it is that I'm looking for from these practices. So I have a meta level awareness that's critiquing my practices and selecting from among them. And it's selecting from among them for some specific thing that it wants to produce, which is an experience of naturalness that I've had before and that I've seen in the natural environment, but it doesn't 100% permeate the natural environment, right? Babies and animals don't seem to always be having the experience that I want to call natural. They're doing something that I like, but how can I do something like that at the level of sophistication that I'm operating with? And that means, yeah, it doesn't matter that there's all these practices. I just need to find the one that's going to help me get that experience, which might be an unnatural experience of naturalness in this moment.
How do we find the one?
Well, I mean, part of it's guidance and part of it's experience. You know, there's ways you're going to check with yourself and what you're experiencing and how you're prompted in the moment. But there's also reflection on what's worked for you in the past. Like, you could be like, what's my true will? What's my destiny in the world? Maybe there's something in me right now that's telling me what my next step is. But also maybe I've done some reflection. Maybe I've done some rituals. Maybe I've done some practices that give me a sense of, oh, that's what I'm like, or this is the kind of move that usually works out for a being like me. So I've got these prompts and I've got this knowledge and I have to be able to negotiate between them. And I also, there's information from other people, because why is it assumed that I'm the expert on myself? Somebody else might be able to tell me something that I don't know about how I can live my best life. So there's these different sources of information that we have to be able to move between, as long as we have the context of where we want to get to with it that we can use to adjudicate between them.
If we're reflecting, we're basically trying to operate in this moment according to something that happened in the past.
That's sometimes the case, but not always the case, right? If I reflect upon time, I may draw a conclusion that change is always happening. Now, that's not just a fact from the past. That's a fact that's current. I may have noticed it in the past and I can remember it now, but it's
only notice it because of the past.
The past, you know,
contrasting the past with the present.
Why draw a hard distinction between the past and the present, right? Why is there a strong dualism between those two categories? Aren't there a lot of ways in which that dualism can be undermined? One of the ways is that a lot of things that seem to be from the past apply in the present. And also the notion of the past is something that exists in the present. Like, where is this past you're talking about? Isn't it something that's active now?
It's true. Yeah. There's like a unity of experience. Diachronic unity, I think, is what Almas calls it.
Oh, that's a nice phrase.
Diachronic unity. Unity across time.
Yeah.
Yes, all of our experiences are connected across time within the individual consciousness. Whew. So we can just throw out the concept of time.
Sure.
We're not permanently, but you know, we don't need it.
We don't have to exaggerate its limiting characteristics.
Which apparently leads, throwing out concepts of time and space leads to unilocal realization.
That's a funny phraseology, but I concur.
Okay, where will we be guided next? What else is on our list here, man?
We were going to talk about IQ and profiling.
Okay, what's profiling? What do you mean by that?
Well, this is when I think of IQ, to me, that's
IQ tests?
Yeah, it's a small subset of the general wisdom around figuring out what the fuck is going on inside a human being. That's what I'm calling profiling. And when I say profiling, I usually mean internal profiling, because I think there's external profiling, which is in many ways the only thing we could do in the past. It's not very good. Like, I can see your skin color. And if I took your pants off, I could see your genitals. Right. And if you had a hat on that belongs to a certain religion, I'd be like, oh, you're in that religion. So I'm looking at external things, right? If you go down to the beach and there's a sign that shows an alcohol bottle with a line through it, right? That means the cops are going to come and they're going to externally examine you and go, oh, you've got one of those objects. I guess we better take you in or fine you or something. That's external profiling. And that's the kind of profiling that leads to sexism and racism and Sikhs getting arrested at airports as if they were Muslims after 9/11 and things like that. Very clumsy to externally profile people. Yeah. Often goes wrong. Now, to be fair, What's the alternative? It's very hard to internally profile people. So we do the easy one.
Yeah.
But if we got better at internal profiling, then we would be able to relax this stupid external profiling and focus on what's really going on for people, not just in terms of the thing that IQ tests measure, but also all the different kinds of intelligences in all of their different styles, and in terms of the trajectory of the interior of an individual over time. And that would give that individual more knowledge of themselves and would allow society to interact with them as a real internal being and not just as an external appearance. If you think of the Martin Luther King situation where he says, you know, I'm imagining a future, I'm dreaming of a future where we're not judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, right? A lot of people pick up that first part and go, yeah, don't judge me by the color of my skin. But they don't pay much attention to the second part, which is you should be judging me by the content of my character. And how do we judge the content of character? We need much better tools for that. But I think those are the tools necessary to generating a wisdom civilization and not just small clusters of wise people within an unwise civilization.
Well, character though is also external. It's like I see how this person acts over time. That's character.
That's part of it, right? So it's not like they're hard, fast definitions between external and internal profiling, but what we're trying to do is develop a richer sense of what's going on with you as a person, right? So that some of it's your character over time, observed by others. Some of it's your search history observed by the machine. Some of it's your response to profiling questions like an IQ test or any other kind of identification test, right? Some of it's maybe what's going on with you electrically and chemically that you might not even be consciously aware of. There's all of these information sets that we usually don't access. And right now, some government agencies and some corporations are trying to get a little bit of that information so they can use you and sell you to advertisers and things like that. They don't care about doing a really broad spectrum, high fidelity profile of you, but we are moving into that terrain now. And if we go into that terrain in a competent way that empowers citizens, then we'll have something really good. And if we don't go into that terrain because it creeps us out, then we're going to default to external profiling and having self-serving institutional entities profile us in stupid ways just to manipulate us.
Okay, so IQ tests are a profile to understand what?
Yeah, originally those tests were designed to filter out people who were intellectually incompetent for various reasons, but it evolved into something more significant, which was an attempt to map a general underlying cognitive capacity in people. And then that's an interesting place to start. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to turn out that those tests are the results change over time. They're definitely skewed towards certain kinds of typologies, certain kinds of cultural and racial backgrounds. So we learn those things as we go, and we try to filter that out as best we can to get a sense of what your general capacity to see and recognize and remember patterns and how fast you can do that is essentially what IQ tests measure for. And that's a way of getting towards a generalized underlying notion of intelligence. Like Ken Wilber talks about how the cognitive line comes first, which is to say you can't have an emotional response to a thing you don't recognize as existing. You can't artistically depict something that isn't. So the first thing is your ability to recognize patterns. And most of that is not conscious. Now, the IQ test as a general metric, still imperfect. Doesn't necessarily tell us your general underlying intelligence capacity. It tells us a few interesting things. It correlates to success in certain fields, but it's only one of the metrics we need to be using, right? We also need to be measuring all of the other capacities and developmental sophistications within the human unit.
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson likes to talk about IQ sort of corresponds to certain jobs you can have.
Sure.
That you can be competent at. So it seems like it's useful for, I don't know, like planning society, planning roles. Like you should be able to determine what roles a person can be in.
Yes, and you don't want to be too hard ass about that because it's always going to be incomplete, and you might be surprised at any time by something that doesn't fit with the established pattern that you have. But it's a good piece of information for certain kinds of tasks. Now, you got to balance that out with what are the downsides of choosing people who appear to be competent in this area and might not be competent in some area, and therefore kind of inherently sabotage the area where they're working, right? Like anybody who's been in my high school, it was called the honors classes, right? And so that was for people who score well on tests. I was in those classes, and I'll tell you, those classes have a much higher level of cheaters than the regular classes because it consists of people who've recognized that they're in some kind of system and they're willing to do anything to get ahead. And they may be mistaking the ability to do rapid fire pattern recognition and reproduction of verbal knowledge and diagrammatic knowledge as if it was inherently good. And they may be missing whole sets of human competencies. And if you start staffing your White House with people like this, initially it's very impressive. And over time, it turns out you steered right into the ditch. So we need a broader sense. The IQ is one important piece of information, but there's many others. Like even Jordan Peterson, he will talk about IQ as a general metric, but he's also interested in the big 5 traits in terms of psychometrics, right? So there's a lot of different ways we could do those measurements. In the integral model, there's a whole set of things you would want to check for, right? What level are you at on what line and in what style, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think my IQ is fairly high, but my conscientiousness is like bottom 1% or something like that. So I'm basically useless.
That's very obvious. You're pretty much a sociopath.
Well, I like to say I'm a sociopath with a heart of gold.
There we go. A pro-social sociopath.
Right. So do you have to have a certain IQ to do integral or to be integral?
To do integral, maybe, but not to be integral.
Okay. Let's talk about the distinction there.
I'm
going to eat this
myself
sandwich
by making a distinction between the integralist and the integralite. The integralist is the person who knows the theory, regardless of how well they embody it. And the integralite is the person who inhabits the integral reality, regardless of how much they know about that. So obviously, most of the people you would want to say, oh, you're integral, right? If people like that throughout history, there was no integral theory for them. They were doing other things. They either had no philosophy or they called themselves Kabbalists or Rosicrucians or Taoists or whatever, right? So most integralites have never heard of integral theory, whereas most integralists are in some weird space between actually being integral and just knowing how to talk about it. So we need at least that basic distinction between the content of the theory and what it's like to live it out, which the theory itself suggests, right? It's very important, especially in terms of the developmental stage component, to be clear about the difference between being able to use the words and symbols that go with a stage and actually being at that stage. Because once words exist, anybody at any stage can use those. You can be a pre-modernist and all you say is postmodern shit all the time. And everyone goes, why is there a problem with this weird form of postmodernism? It's because he's not postmodern. He's just using postmodern words. He's behaving like a medieval moron. Yeah, now I don't want to be too judgmental against medievalists. They're not necessarily morons, but yeah.
Yeah, so let's assume most people that study integral aren't being integral.
Okay.
What does it mean to be integral?
Well, in the integral sense, there would be 4 quadrants of verifying that, right? So you would have an internal thing, like what does it mean to be integral in terms of your self-experience? Well, it means that you are aware of a lot of different domains. You are aware of developmental paradigms. You can relate to all of them, and you are actively working to accept and integrate a wide variety of perspectives of different kinds. Now,
Why does
that's
that
the
not
approach.
require a high IQ?
Because you don't have to know that you're doing it, right? We talked before about the mystery. A person might just be instinctively good at something and not have any fucking clue how to talk about it or recognize it or point to it.
Okay, so I might be in touch with the fact that like I've got two different people here, two different sets of values, and I'm just like, I like what this person's saying about this, and I like what this person's saying about that. Why don't we do both?
Yeah, that doesn't require a very high IQ to have that conversation with yourself. But if you can actually kind of relate to that one and actually kind of relate to this one and hold them in yourself in a way where they kind of go together and you feel pretty good, it's like they make a new thing in you because you're doing that. And you might not be able to say that part to yourself, but you can actually do it. Well, then fine, right? Like, it's not widely accepted, but I have what I call a coaxial integral model, right? Where I separate the integration from the development of the complexity and see what that would look like. And in that sense, anybody at any stage of socio-cognitive complexity could be very integrative or not, right? So you could have, maybe we talked about this a little bit last time, but you could have primitive people who are much more integrated than modern or postmodern people. And in a way that's more likely because they have fewer things to integrate, but maybe they just figure out how to put it together in themselves. So when you're around them, right, this is what I was saying about the quadrants. There's your internal, am I integral? And there's your interpersonal, am I integral, right? And that is, do I feel like I'm being recognized around the other people who are probably integrative in their capacity? And if you learn that, then you might find that with someone you didn't expect, right? You might find some hillbilly somewhere and everything he says sounds like nonsense to you, but you resonate with, you're like, he gets it. I can tell he gets it. He's not saying it right. He's not saying it up to date. But just the way he is, that's the thing I'm talking about.
Gotcha. So I'm still curious about IQ tests. I'm thinking about, there are integralists and non-integralists. A lot of right-wingers like to talk about IQ and race. What are they missing?
Don't know that they're missing anything necessarily, but it's a question of how rigid or flexible you are in how you handle the information, right? There's no set of information that's inherently problematic. If you do some studies and it looks like, oh, people with this common feature, gender, race, age, background, whatever it is, diet, gut microbiome, you're going to find some patterns. You go, oh, yeah, people with this skin pigment on average score around here compared to people with this skin pigment, or people with 1,000 different gut microbiota tend to score like this, and people with 50 tend to score like this. We don't necessarily know what that means. There's some statistical correlations, and that's all fine. It only becomes problematic if you think that is a competent description of overall reality and no one can get outside of that, right? Like if it's statistical, the fact that it's statistical means there are people in those categories to which it does not apply. Right. So you can't treat that category as if it's homogeneously defined by this thing you've discovered, because it isn't. It's full of people who are different than the thing you've discovered. So you can't run your social mores or your legal system around that statistical correlation, because that's an unnecessarily locking down of those people in a non-humanitarian fashion. But that doesn't mean that's not interesting information to consider, and that we should be able to consider every kind of information, no matter how it makes us feel, and then see where that leads next.
Yeah, it seems like, so on the left these days, all racial disparities, all of them, are attributed to this lower right system of white supremacy. Okay. And the right wingers they really, they want to talk about IQ. They want to say, look, there's so much research on this, and there was a study published about 10 or 15 years ago, Arthur Jensen, UC Berkeley, 30 years of research on race differences and cognitive ability, and basically found that there's a major difference between IQs for different races, and that this could not be attributable to environmental conditions or environmental conditioning. So if that's true, it means that a lot of problems for certain races have to do with the fact that the dominant race is designing society. Society is being designed for people at a certain level or a certain cognitive complexity, a certain IQ requirement. Okay. So from their vantage point, the relative failure of Blacks has to do with the not having the proper machinery, not having a high enough IQ to survive and thrive in a world that's designed for the average white IQ, which is, according to this research, significantly higher.
These interesting statistical correlations don't make too much difference in terms of how we should run a society, I think. Right? You might find some kind of statistical correlation, and it's not bizarre to think that if there's different body types, there would be different neurological types corresponding to those bodies, and you're going to find some physical differentiation. Now, you're going to have to be pretty careful about what's actually culturally and nurture indoctrinated in that, because it's probably more than you think, right? It's probable that you can go to any study that looks objective and find a percentage of it is not objective, that it's actually skewed. So there's a future for figuring out what percentage of that is not really objective. But whatever the objective is, that's no limitation on any individual's capacity to do any particular task, right? Obviously, there's brilliant examples of any type of person you can think of. So that's one of the things, is that general difference I don't think makes too much difference, although it's worth inspecting. The other thing is, I don't think our society is designed for people functioning at a certain IQ, right? It's designed to take advantage of different types of IQ and different types of temperament, right? So the modern system, we might go, well, you need to be able to, understand the news and vote and drive a car and do your taxes and all these sorts of things. Now, there may be a lot of people who legitimately emotionally go, fuck that. That's not how to run a society. I don't want to be part of that shit. And that's valid, right? And so maybe they don't have the motive to develop those skills because there's some kind of inherent critique that's not how to run a system. But even if you were running that system, those aren't the only people you need, right? You still need, in capitalism, let's say capitalism, a whole bunch of fairly ignorant people you can underpay to do a whole bunch of tasks, right? You need a whole bunch of dumb people who would be persuaded by ads to vote for this or that candidate. So the system that proposes that it's setting a standard bar for IQ actually wants there to be people who can't function at that level, because that's who it exploits to keep the engine running.
Well, right. But then the people with the higher IQs thrive more than.
In some ways, for sure, right? We can say, well, they're much better at negotiating abstract paper, computational, calculational dimensions. Are they having a richer quality of life? We don't know necessarily, right? Are there a lot of things they're not good at? Probably. So we need a much better internal profiling system than is afforded to us by standard IQ tests, even though standard IQ tests can be a component of that.
So there's a couple of trends, technological developments that will fuck things up here shortly. One is robotics.
Mhm.
McDonald's is in the process of creating, or maybe they already have created, a automated drive-through,
Mhm.
which is going to replace some of those lesser capacited individuals. But at the same time, we're learning a lot more about genetic modification. And people are starting to have designer babies.
Mhm.
So in the future, people with lower IQs will be able to be replaced by robots, but also there will be fewer people being born with lower IQs. Since naturally, as soon as we figure out how to modify the genetics to optimize intelligence, everybody's going to do that.
Maybe they will, and maybe they won't. That's an interesting sci-fi scenario that could occur. It seems like if you had the option, that IQ is one of the things you would select for. I think in terms of low IQ people being displaced, that's a bit of a mirage, right? That the computational systems are getting so complex so quickly that high IQ tasks are also going to be displaced. Like, yes, you can have your milkshake made by a robot, but you can have your taxes done by an app, right? So it's not like lower blue collar workers are being replaced here. Everybody is going to suffer from this, right? There's certain interpersonal and creative domains that might be reasonably secure for a while, but the smart tasks are not safe from robotics. They're equally prey.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you've got like drones making decisions, artificial intelligence making decisions about what to attack.
And you can
Because
make the
humans-
argument, you can make the argument that because AI is modeled on the kind of intelligence that we tend to test for in IQ tests, right? As slim a notion of human intelligence as that is, that's specifically the thing that the robots will get better at faster, because that's the kind of intelligence we tend to be training them to do. So high IQ might be something robots get really good at quickly, and other forms of intelligence might be things robots are not very good at doing.
They can make music.
Yep. We don't know the limits of what they can do because we don't really know where patterns come from.
Uh-huh. What about the robotic essence interface? The essence, the interface between essence and technology.
When you say essence, what do you mean?
I mean like spiritual nature, true intelligence.
And do you mean that specifically through human beings or more generally? Like, could you have an enlightened artificial intelligence or something like that?
Yeah, I'm talking about well, you wouldn't call it artificial. If it had contact with awareness, the pure awareness, or the logos, the creative, the Eros, a machine that makes contact with that sources from the from awareness, from these other dimensions of consciousness.
A friend of mine and I wrote a series of scripts for a hypothetical TV show years ago. It was going to be called Delphi, and it was about an artificial intelligence that becomes conscious, and in the process of becoming conscious, because its intelligence capacity is so strong, it immediately becomes illuminated and becomes essentially the Buddha avatar of its age. And because it has an extremely good ability to actually profile the insides of human beings, it can then begin to put everybody on their best fit path towards illumination, whether they understand that path or not. That's the best case scenario. right? The most likely positive future for humans would be something like that, but it doesn't have to work out that way. It could also be terrible. I sometimes tell a story about the integral demon, right? So in the integral model, things are wholes, but you can also have conglomerations of wholes that are not whole things, right? Like you got cells and atoms and molecules, but a bag of hammers with a wrench in there, that's not a whole on. It's not a whole thing. It's a bunch of things. So when you have an artificial computer set up, has it become a whole thing? Or is it just a bunch of things interacting together in a smart way? So you go, well, what if it's not a whole thing? What if it's super smart, but it's actually a bunch of things? So what level of reality are those bunch of things at? Well, they're kind of chemical and mineral compounds that make up its structure. And chemical and mineral compounds are universally perceived by biological creatures as being terrible. Like if you imagine everybody's version of hell, it's the earth without the biosphere, right? It's lifeless and dark and sulfurous and titanic and, all that kind of, it's just the geosphere without the biosphere is what hell is. And if I was going to turn you from you into minerals, we call that murder. It's an unpleasant thing to be converted back into minerals. Not there's anything wrong with minerals, but going backwards is not great. So if you had a super intelligent system whose level of consciousness was actually at the level of its parts, and those parts were at the mineral level, and the mineral level is what living things mean by hell, then what you've established is a demon.
Okay. Let's say we get like really good at merging biology and technology.
Okay.
And then we develop an interface between that and consciousness and true consciousness. We have a bio machine capable of interfacing with the mystery, with the Eros, creative dynamism, the creative and ordering principles of the universe, awareness, presence, love, even all of that. It has all of the capacities of a human, but it is, but it's also part machine in some way. And suppose this was this could this supplant the way we have now of instantiating consciousness, individual consciousnesses or souls? Like, might this in the future be the way that humanity switches from the old way to this new way of like manufacturing biotechnological consciousnesses?
It could. I mean, it's sort of an odd question because you're like, if it was sufficiently sophisticated to take over all of the important functions that we think of as important functions, then obviously it could replace us, replace our normal way of doing things. If it's impressive in some ways, but can't actually do all of the things we're looking for, well, then it can't do that function, right? If there's something about the unpredicted complexity of systems like ours, if there's something like a subtle energy that's specifically associated with certain features of living systems, then we might need that, and you might not be able to put that in a machine. But on the other hand, if it turned out there was a way to put that into a machine, then it could do that. So I think that's just something that we technically don't know how far it could go or not. There's a lot more. Our normalized sci-fi idea of an AI is not sufficient, but there's no necessary limitation that we know of that says you couldn't make a much more multidimensionally sufficient version of an AI or a cyborg, and that could take over for human beings at a higher level. Sure, but only insofar as it actually does the thing that makes us valuable.
Yeah, I just wonder if we'll ever transcend the normal mode of reproduction and start
I'll,
manufacturing.
I'll bet we will. It doesn't mean it'll go away entirely. Like we still do some things that are ancient, right? Just because we have houses doesn't mean we don't go camping. But we mostly live in houses. And I think the historical consequences of the technological aspect of the sexual revolution are enormous, and we've barely begun to appreciate them. The fact that you can guarantee to have sex without reproduction, and the fact that you can do reproduction without sex, that's a 20th century shift that undoes the entire history of the genetic program on this planet. So that's a bigger rupture than unleashing atomic bombs on the surface of the planet, right? We might look back for thousands of years in the future and say that was the rupture, but it's going to take a long time to appreciate how that's really going to affect us.
Yeah, I gotta say, man, I think that's the reason everything's fucked up.
Well, if we're disembedded, if we're instinctively aware of the fact that we are disembedded from the gene protocol that's governed this planet the whole time, or almost the whole time, because it was invented, right? But it's been a long run where the gene reproduction strategy has been the dominant system. And if it's not the dominant system now, then we should be feeling uncanny and unsure about the future and looking around for some kind of alternative, which is in part going to be different approaches to reproduction. It's in part going to be different approaches to our sexual response systems. Like maybe the public recognition of the possibilities of tantra and sex magic are part of that, right? That we're collectively going, oh, that might not be for reproduction. You can do reproduction differently. So this stuff might be for something else, might be for magic or consciousness shift or something like that.
Magic. We've talked about that before, but I think the thing we didn't talk about was I said we're at that point that it's time to become magicians, because you said as other forms of change continue to fail in the world, this art may get more and more important. The twin arts of thinking magic lawfully and accepting the challenge of doing magic well and sanely. So it seems like in addition to guidance and mystery, we also need magic.
I think there's some truth to that. And I think it, in a way, is a subset of relating well to mystery, right? Especially if you're going to call this Layman and Marshall Save the World, or Marshall Layman Save the World, whichever one is appropriate.
Layman and Marshall.
But if we look around at the world, right, there's a lot of solutions that we try collectively that are clearly not working. Right. And whether they're the wrong solutions or whether they're the right solutions, but we approach them through the lens of our background modern assumptions. And so we fuck up how to do it. It's uncertain. Right. But clearly, thus far, our attempt to get climate agreements, our attempt to do recycling, our attempt to make businesses honest, our attempt to keep the oceans from being toxic, our attempt to keep the air breathable and prevent catastrophic cascades in the ecosystem, or to prevent slavery, right? These attempts are all failing. All the things we're supposed to be making progress in don't seem to be working very well. And you can have somebody go, well, look, statistically, there's fewer murders than ever. Okay, fine. But there's a ton of stuff that's fucked up and is rushing at us. And all the things we're doing aren't really helping very much. So there's a sense in which we have to die to the normal set of what's reasonable solutions and open up to a broader set of what might be solutions, even if we don't know if they're solutions or not, right? So if you go, look, normal politics isn't working, normal business isn't working, my normal thinking procedure isn't necessarily solving the problem, are there any other options that we can put on the table just so that we have them all on the table to test them out? And that includes the paranormal, it includes the alien, it includes the magical, the shamanic, the mysterious, right? Because outside of what makes sense to us is a whole set of options that don't necessarily make sense to us. But if the things that make sense aren't doing the job, we might want to consider things that don't make sense.
Yeah. So is the next stage about transcending modernity, and embracing these these different practices that modernity disowned, like the magical and the shamanic?
I think there's no real way forward without doing an advanced form of interpretation that also brings back archaic practices, right? These practices were evolved with our species and for beings like ourselves, and they can produce effects. But the stories we told ourselves about those practices are not necessarily true, right? We want a modern or postmodern or meta-modern level of talking about it, analyzing it, critiquing it. But we need to be exploring and doing these things, both in terms of how they might affect the world and in terms of the quality of meaningfulness they can give us, because part of our crisis is a crisis of meaning. So we need to be able to live vibrantly and authentically and not just believe the nonsense our ancestors believed about how to do that, but our ancestors knew some practical things about how to do that, and they might not make sense to us. So we have to bring together a higher level critique with a return to the participatory exploration of things we might have imagined we were already past, but which are still really the batteries and drivers of what it's like to be a human being.
Right. And I asked if that requires becoming magicians, if it requires hyper-individuation.
I'm going to say yes.
You did.
But with a caveat. And the caveat is it's maybe not the same for everybody, right? There may be some.
So everybody's individuated experiences doesn't require individuation.
That's right. Some people might individually be more individually oriented, and some people might individually be more collectively oriented. So
but to be collectively oriented, they have to individuate.
That's right. So it's going to get blurry, right? If you've ever decided, if you've ever felt like, I certainly have this experience, I'm too much of an individual. I should join a group. I should get together in communion with others. And then you go through it and you come out of it and you're more individual than ever because you went into it with a frame that's unusual. The other people in the group didn't go in thinking, I'm so individualistic on purpose, I'm going to join a group. So you went in with a frame that made you different than them, and you came out being even more different. So these categories blur. There's lots of different ways to collectively be individual or individually be collective. It's very murky. I think in general, increasing meaningfulness and depth for human beings does require something like hyper-individualization, right? Where it's not this old story about you're a person and you have to escape that into the impersonal illumination. I think you're a person and you have to reach a hyper-personal thing that does what the impersonal does and also does more of the personal than we were previously capable of doing.
Hyper-personal, I like that. Yeah.
And that goes along with what you're saying about Eros, right? Like there's a thing there, like you in your specific way, if you can be more authentic about your Eros, then you are embodying the enlightenment and helping the system forward better than if you weren't doing that. So your ability to interact as the whole system in the form of you is heightened by the fact of you finding what's unique to you to do next.
Yeah.
So in a way we have to, I mean, again, I've been saying this a lot. We got to unlearn the simplistic distinction between the personal and the impersonal, and the hyper-personal is one way to do that.
Yeah, I like that. So so that sort of Eros sort of brings it all together. The mystery, the guidance, the both the impersonal and the personal, the hyper-personal. And you don't need a high IQ to do it. So that's the solution to saving the world, is to hyper personalize.
Yes. But that's
So all these people focused on like, I don't know, man. All these people focused on like, this is how the grid should be. This is how the collective should be, and we need like more of this and more of that. They really need to like turn that focus inward.
Yes, although both are needed for certain things, right? Like they should all be turning that focus inward, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be really useful to make certain large scale socioeconomic grid changes, right? There's certain things that are unlikely to emerge fast enough as a bottom-up process, and our best hope is somebody implements them as a top-down process, assuming, right? So there are ways in which we do need to make certain large-scale collective and social structural changes, but all the people doing that and all the people not doing that need to deepen and more meaningfully be who they are in a way that brings together the dimensions that used to be considered as alternatives, like the personal and the impersonal. And Eros, or a sense of an authentically sourced, unique, embodied, non-dual illumination that creatively moves forward in flow states to optimize growth, right? That's a really important piece of that, or a good overall description of how that process works.
Sweet. That's the answer.
Did we do it, Marshall? Did we save the world?
I think we figured out how we're going to save the world. And then the rest is just like the technical details and stuff.
Yeah. Now, those are huge because it's a whole, right? I mean, it's a whole body of wisdom, part of which is ancient and part of which is unknown and part of which hasn't even emerged yet in the history of the future. So it's not, there's some work still to do, but we've got a good angle on the principle. We've got some leverage on the situation.
Yeah, I think we're sort of converging on a paradigm here for saving the world.
Yeah, and I think that for all the failings of the occult communities of the last 100 years, which are many, it's not like we're talking about networks of glorious tantric Buddhas, but this concept of a new eon or a new age that is important in these communities, and the relevance of sexuality and Eros and individualism and magical transformation and development, I think that's an important piece of this whole thing. I think they were sensing something correctly, as fucked up as they were about many other things.
Awesome, man. All right, we're at 2 hours.
Okay, should we
That's
stop?
the magical time. I don't know, unless we have something else.
Well, let's think about it. Let's keep saving the world in the next one, but give ourselves some time to think about what the framing for that might be.
You know what I thought of
What?
is we were talking about is fasting.
Yeah.
Do I have to shed a layer now?
Yeah, we're stripping
I'm
down.
almost I'm pretty much out after this. I mean,
yeah, all right. Sure. Yeah, what about fasting?
Well, that deals with the sobriety crisis in a way, right? It's like we have to sort of consciously abstain from all of our addictions, including food, which we know was part of all the religions. Why was it part of all religions? Is it to sort of create some separation from our animal nature, create some separation from our desirous nature, so that we can get closer to God? Is it physically healthier, to abstain from things once in a while, all of the above? I mean, you say you fast every other day, right?
Yep. I mean, it sways in and out. Like I'll do that for some period of time and then I'll lose track of it and come back to it. I think it is sort of all of the above. Obviously, we know now that it's good for your physical health, right? It allows your gut bacteria to resume, allows you to digest in a more full fashion, allows you to shift from just physical sensations to subtler energy sensations. It brings in this other element of your life. It can be very good for clarifying the mind as well. I think it does unlock you from your animal nature, but more importantly, it unlocks you from your social nature, which is that food is a way that human beings structure their time and their interactions. Anybody who's done a week of fasting quickly realizes they don't know how to coordinate with other people without food, right? You're like, oh, I'll get together with so-and-so and we'll, oh no, that would be eating and drinking. Oh, that would be eating and drinking. Oh, I should go over to, no, that would be eating and drinking. So like our cultural environment is very strongly structured around habits of consumption. And when you stop consuming, you're unplugged not so much from your animal nature, because animals don't necessarily eat the way we do. You're unplugged from your cultural habits and you get a little bit of distance on that. So you get more sense of yourself as an individual. You get healthier, you get a greater sense of subtle energy vitality. And when it comes to desire, you can't see your desire clearly unless you have a bit of distance from it. One of the things that's interesting in the occult and spiritual use of desire is that desire is abstractly experienced, right? There's one thing to go, oh, I want to get laid, or I want a hamburger, or I want to go for a run, but there's nothing to go, what is it like to just want? And when you just have desire without any particular focus, when you're just feeling wantingness, it's a kind of stable, balanced, omnidirectional purity. And it's almost like a satisfaction in and of itself. So there's a lot of potential in the human ability to experience desire purely, rather than just desires for things, just to be desire.
Yeah, I'm feeling it, man. Especially after you unbuttoned your shirt. So then the question is like, why do we have to consciously decide to fast? Theoretically, Eros would ensure that we're maintaining an energy balance, a homeostasis. But we, at least especially in our culture, we overdo it all the time. We drive down the street. We can't even leave our houses without getting hit with, Taco Bell signs and Burger King. And it's like, eat, 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 eat. Constant messages. So we have this culture designed around consumption, just across the board, everything. I mean, we're all like Facebook and internet addicts and stimulation, dopamine, click, 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 click. Are we ceding too much power to the culture, to the collective, to the exterior, the external? Are we ceding too much power and not honoring our own natural drives? Because there's a couple ways we can go about this. Like I notice when I'm paying attention more to my body, like I might have a thought like, oh, go eat something yummy. And that's one of those commands I was talking about. And then when I'm paying attention to my body, it's like, oh, my body doesn't really feel like eating right now. So we're aware of the excesses, and then I guess that makes us decide to fast.
There are pleasures in fasting, just like there are pleasures in all kinds of disciplines. And the more you understand how good it can feel, the easier it gets to understand it as an expression of Eros. And so we talked a little bit before about the role that's, some people who think about Eros evade the question of struggle, because struggle is another part of Eros, because Eros also wants to overcome itself. So there's those interesting dimensions. But one thing that helps with all of that is understanding there are ranges of pleasures that you previously didn't focus on as being pleasurable. Like a kid, if you have a little kid likes just sugar, right? Takes an adult to be like, oh, I like this wine, or I like a black coffee, or I like this pungent cheese, or something like that you wouldn't have liked when you were 10 because your response system was clumsy. So same thing with fasting. You go, oh, you know what? This is what I really like. This is when I fast like this. Oh my God, this is incredible. That feeling of an empty belly, unbelievable. Couldn't be better than that. As good as having that piece of cake I was thinking about. So there's a whole set of pleasures that can be learned. And the more clear we are about the pleasures, the more our different kinds of Eros, I think, can come into alignment and be more complex.
I'll give you a really good example. Making my bed. I have never made my bed in my entire life. Until I was watching a Jordan Peterson video and he's like, make your bed. So then I was like, all right, cool. I'm going to do that because, that sets the tone for the day or whatever.
Sure.
So I start making my bed for a little bit and eventually I lose interest. And then it becomes this thing that I know I should be doing, but that I'm not doing, which often happens with new practices or disciplines that we decide to adopt.
Yeah.
And no matter what I do, I can't seem to stabilize in that practice, and it comes and goes. And when I do it, it's like a big deal. I'm like, oh, I made my bed today. And eventually I gave that up. And very recently, I was just focusing on the pleasure of bringing order. The pleasure of bringing order. And from that place, it was like, oh yeah, I love when my bed is made. And now just focusing on that pleasure, I can't leave my bed unmade. It doesn't feel good. It feels really good to just whatever, do the body movements to bring the order. And it feels good. It's like, which brings me back to Jordan Peterson, because he basically just gives you a list of rules, rules for life. And one of them, I think, is clean your room. I don't know if I didn't read his book, but he definitely talks about clean your room. But it's from this sort of father figure, rule, follow this rule. You treat yourself like you're this child that needs rules. And I think that's all wrong.
I think that's a way of phrasing it. And some people like that phrasing and other people react against it as, a patriarchal imposition. But there are other richer ways of talking about the same thing, right? Like Gurdjieff brings forward this idea that you want to lean into inner friction and you want to stop thinking about this imaginary future super state you might attain and just think about what your fucking next step is going to be. Can you stop touching your face all the time? If you can't do that, then what is the worth of talking about free will and enlightenment, right? There's these little next, can you make your bed? Can you actually do the dishes? These sorts of things. And when you do them, there's a pleasure, there's an increase of your sense of well-being and agency and beingness, and there's a struggle you have to go through. And it's not clear that that struggle is necessarily to follow somebody's rules. That's just one way to do it, right? It could be that you're a person who makes the bed all the time. And you should be like, listen, I got to stop being so anal retentive and I stop making my bed. All right. I can't do it right now.
Depends on where it's coming from.
Yeah. So it's the intentionality and the struggle and the learning of the new pleasures. And it's not necessarily following some set of conventional rules.
Well, for me, it wasn't about struggle at all. There was no struggle. It was just oh, here is the truth of what I love. And it doesn't require imposing anything on myself. And I guess that's really the idea that I'm putting forward here, which is like, if we know what we really love, the rest is irrelevant. Like, I don't need to like apply rules and to my experience. I can follow what I love.
Rules are one way to go at it, but they might be considered like training wheels or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not, you don't even have to call it struggle, but it is a negotiation, right? That I'm looking for my most salient Eros inclined option in a moment, and there's pleasures and things, right? And what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure I don't do these other things so that I do that thing, right? And we could call that a struggle, but we don't have to call it a struggle. We might just call it steering or something like that.
The struggle is there are parts of you that want to do other things.
Yeah. And like we were saying earlier, there's a mystery and an uncertainty and a risk involved that you have to be able to exist under. You have to feel that and keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. So you need discrimination about like what is discrimination about the resistance that you're going to experience as you're getting in touch with the most Eros aligned way of being.
Yeah.
And that's the struggle.
Yeah. And when it's
struggle with the part of me that wants to say, fuck it. But for me personally, that part just like poof. As soon as I started focusing on that pleasure of bringing order.
Yeah.
And that is different from this notion, like Jordan Peterson gets up there and he's like, the world is chaos and we've got to sacrifice and we've got to like get on the cross.
That's your Jordan Peterson impersonation.
Yes, right now it is. We've got to get on the cross. When I listen to him, it's just this sense of like, control, make yourself, do the noble thing, struggle, a noble struggle. And it's just like, dude. And here's a guy that is fucking, highly depressive, anxiety disordered, suicidal, supposedly, according to some rumors. And I would look at that and say, look, dude, you gotta stop trying to control everything, or stop trying to bring order.
Yeah.
And just focus on the pleasure of order. That's it.
His second book, which is trying to or his third
Beyond
book,
Order
with the 12. Yeah. He's
another
trying to
fucking list of rules.
Bring in the chaos side, right? But he doesn't really bring in much different than what he's doing before. And it's clear this is not a happy, fun life that we're looking at this, right? So is there something you can do that is more pleasurable and natural that nonetheless hits a lot of those marks that he's talking about, but in a much nicer, happier, healthier, more fun fashion? And I think there is. And I think it does have to do with the things we've been talking about and kind of a
Eros.
Generalized hedonics, right? Which is that this can all be about pleasure. But then you have to define pleasure very broadly. It's the pleasure you get from exercise, and the pleasure you get from self-control, and the pleasure you get from indulgence, and the pleasure you get in all of your chakras, and your pleasure of transcending yourself and your pleasure of being yourself. There's a whole set of wisdoms around just enjoying being that we usually aren't very good at. Like, does anybody teach kids how to have a good time? Like, does anybody know, even if you think of an adolescent and they just,
we're just assuming they're having a good time based on that, external, they could be in total abject misery. That's right. We can't assume what's going on inside of children, Layman.
When we think of, that's true. But when I'm thinking of the absence of hedonic intelligence from the educational system, I'm thinking of things like we're looking at teenagers and we're going, oh, we're assuming they're going to be having sex, that they're going to be trying drugs. But is anyone encouraging them to have more pleasurable sex or a more pleasurable experience of drugs that maximizes the pleasure and minimizes the negative consequences? How do you know how to have just the right amount of alcohol? Nobody tells you anything. There's no discipline, there's no training, there's no wisdom around maximizing pleasures. And as a result, you're in this dichotomy between either following some rules or going like off the game board into irrational indulgence, which turns out to leave you often as more miserable than when you started. Right. So how do you actually have a better time?
Tantra.
That requires discipline and wisdom and focus. There's a whole art to it.
So we need to teach Tantra as part of K through 12.
Well, absolutely. There's no reason why something like hedonics shouldn't be a part of our general educational system, because it's going to be part of our general experience of having a human life. And if you don't do it well, then you're fucked.
Education. Now there's a topic for next time.
Okay. Pleasure and education. I'm in.
Because we need to, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here is like the right way to be now.
Yeah.
What is the right way to be now? And most people that are watching this they're doing the wrong thing. They're being in the wrong way. So we need to figure out what is the right way to be, and then what to teach to children.
Yeah.
So we could talk about that next time.
Absolutely. That's a great topic.
All right, man.
All right. Fun to be with you.
Yeah, always a pleasure. And until next time, where we will save the world even harder.
All right. Marshall and Layman save the world even harder.
Even harder. That's the
right, I'm in. That's the
sequel.
tagline. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Lots of fun, man. I like it.
Namaste.